Picture this. The most powerful man on earth sits alone in his tent on a frozen battlefield along the Danube River. Outside, barbarian tribes mass for another assault on the Roman frontier. Inside, by flickering candlelight, the Emperor of Rome writes in his private journal. Not battle plans or administrative orders, but reflections on death, duty, and the fleeting nature of human existence. This is Marcus Aurelius, philosopher emperor, and his story will challenge everything you think you know about power, wisdom, and what it means to live a meaningful life. Most people who reach the pinnacle of worldly success become consumed by it. They lose themselves in the intoxicating rush of absolute authority. But Marcus Aurelius did something extraordinary. The more power he gained, the more deeply he questioned its value. The higher he rose, the more humble he became. Here was a man who commanded legions, ruled over 60 million people, and controlled an empire that stretched from Britain to the Sahara Desert. And yet his private writings reveal someone tormented by self-doubt, wrestling with mortality, and desperately trying to be a better human being. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want you to do something. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support what we're doing here, and it means the world to me. I'm genuinely curious where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are, so drop a comment and let me know. Now, settle in as we explore the life of a man who proved that true strength comes not from conquering others, but from mastering yourself. This is not just another story about a Roman emperor. This is the story of a human soul's struggle to find meaning in a chaotic world. A story that begins in the marble halls of imperial Rome and ends on the muddy battlefields of the frontier. A story that will take us through palaces and philosophical schools, through moments of triumph and devastating personal loss. By the end, you'll understand why Marcus Aurelius is remembered not for his military victories or political achievements, but for something far more precious: his relentless pursuit of wisdom and his unflinching commitment to doing what is right, even when it cost him everything. But to understand the philosopher, we must first meet the boy who would become emperor. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was born on April 26, 121 AD, into a world of unimaginable privilege. His birth name was Marcus Annius Verus, and he entered life at the very apex of Roman society. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, was a praetor, one of the highest judicial officials in the empire. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, came from a family so wealthy they owned brick factories that supplied much of Rome's construction. This was not merely aristocracy. This was the aristocracy, the families who had shaped Rome when it was still clawing its way to dominance over the Mediterranean world. The Rome of Marcus's childhood was a city of contradictions that would profoundly shape his character. On one hand, it was the beating heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The Forum bustled with merchants from every corner of the known world. Greek philosophers debated in the porticos. Egyptian grain fed the masses. Germanic slaves served in wealthy households. The Colosseum hosted spectacles that drew crowds of 50,000. Aqueducts carried fresh water across hundreds of miles. Roads connected Britain to Syria, Spain to Egypt. It was a miracle of human organisation and ambition. But Rome was also a city of shocking inequality and casual brutality. While patricians like Marcus's family dined on exotic delicacies served on golden plates, the poor crowded into disease-ridden tenements that regularly collapsed or caught fire. Gladiators fought to the death for entertainment. Slaves were bought and sold like livestock. Public executions were theatre, the same civilization that produced magnificent architecture and sophisticated law also thrived on human suffering. Young Marcus absorbed these contradictions. His family's wealth insulated him from the worst of Roman society, but it could not shield him from witnessing its moral complexity. Even as a child, he seems to have possessed an unusual sensitivity to suffering, both his own and that of others. Later in life, he would write about the importance of seeing things as they truly are, not as we wish them to be. This commitment to truth, no matter how uncomfortable, began early. His childhood was marked by loss. Marcus's father died when the boy was just 3 years old. This early encounter with mortality would become a recurring theme in his philosophy. Death, he would later write, is not evil but simply the natural conclusion of life. But for a 3-year-old boy losing his father, such philosophical abstractions offered little comfort. The wound of that early loss never fully healed, though it would eventually transform into wisdom. After his father's death, Marcus was raised primarily by his grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, a man of exceptional character who would become the boy's first and most important teacher. The elder Verus was known throughout Rome for his integrity, his learning, and his devotion to duty. He had served as consul and prefect of the city, positions that required not just political skill, but moral authority. Under his grandfather's guidance, young Marcus learned that privilege came with responsibility, that power existed to serve others, not oneself. The education Marcus received was extraordinary even by the standards of wealthy Roman families. His grandfather spared no expense in hiring the finest tutors available in the empire. Marcus studied grammar and rhetoric, the foundations of Roman education, but his curriculum went far beyond the typical aristocratic training. He learned Greek, of course, for no educated Roman could function without it. Greek was the language of philosophy, medicine, and high culture. But Marcus also studied mathematics, astronomy, and music. He was trained in physical exercise and military arts, for a Roman aristocrat was expected to serve in the legions. Most importantly, Marcus was introduced to philosophy. His grandfather believed that a life without philosophical reflection was not worth living, a conviction that would prove prophetic. The boy was exposed to the major schools of Greek thought: Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, duty, and acceptance of fate; Platonism, with its vision of eternal truths beyond the material world; Aristotelianism, with its systematic approach to understanding nature and society. But it was Stoicism that captured his imagination and would eventually become the foundation of his entire worldview. The Stoic philosophers taught that happiness comes not from external circumstances, but from living in accordance with virtue. They believed that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond. They emphasized duty, courage, justice, and wisdom as the 4 cardinal virtues. They taught that the universe is rationally ordered and that our task as human beings is to understand our place within that order and to play our assigned role with dignity. For a young boy growing up in the world's most powerful family, these ideas were revolutionary. Most aristocratic children were taught that their birth entitled them to privilege, that their wealth and status made them superior to others. But Stoicism taught Marcus that true nobility comes from character, not bloodline. That genuine strength lies in self-mastery, not the domination of others. That the measure of a life is not what you acquire, but how virtuously you live. As Marcus grew older, his exceptional character began to attract attention beyond his family circle. Rome was a society that prized talent and rewarded merit, at least among the elite. Word of the young man's intelligence, integrity, and philosophical bent reached the highest levels of government, and it was there that his life took a dramatic turn that would alter the course of history. In 136 AD, when Marcus was just 15 years old, he caught the attention of the Emperor Hadrian himself. Hadrian was one of the great rulers in Roman history, a man of extraordinary intelligence and wide-ranging interests. He was an architect who designed the Pantheon, a military commander who secured the empire's borders, a legal reformer who codified Roman law, and a lover of Greek culture who travelled extensively throughout his domains. Hadrian was also a man without a natural heir, and he was keenly aware that the succession question would determine the empire's future. Hadrian had been watching the young Marcus Aurelius, and what he saw impressed him deeply. Here was a boy who combined intellectual brilliance with moral seriousness, who seemed immune to the corruption that so often accompanied wealth and privilege. Hadrian began to consider the unthinkable. Could this 15-year-old be the future of Rome? The emperor's interest in Marcus was not merely personal. Hadrian understood that the Roman Empire faced unprecedented challenges. The barbarian tribes along the frontiers were growing stronger and more organized. The economy was straining under the costs of maintaining such a vast territory. Social tensions were rising as the gap between rich and poor widened. Traditional Roman values were eroding under the influence of foreign cults and philosophies. The empire needed a leader who combined practical ability with moral authority, someone who could inspire loyalty not through fear but through respect. But Hadrian was a cautious man who understood the complexities of imperial succession. Direct appointment of such a young heir would be politically dangerous, potentially triggering civil war among ambitious generals and senators. Instead, Hadrian devised an elegant solution. He would adopt Antoninus Pius, a respected senator in his 50s, as his son and heir. But Antoninus, in turn, would adopt both Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, ensuring a smooth succession through 2 generations. This arrangement satisfied multiple political necessities while positioning Marcus for eventual rule. Antoninus Pius was old enough and experienced enough to govern effectively, but also old enough that his reign would likely be relatively short. Marcus and Lucius, as co-heirs, would provide stability and continuity. The plan revealed Hadrian's political genius and his confidence in Marcus's potential. When Hadrian announced his succession plan in 138 AD, Marcus was just 17 years old. Overnight, he went from being a wealthy young aristocrat to being the designated future emperor of Rome. The weight of this responsibility was staggering. At an age when most young men are concerned with parties and romance, Marcus found himself preparing to rule the world. The transition was not without its complications. Marcus was engaged to the daughter of Lucius Gaionius Commodus, whom Hadrian had originally chosen as his heir before the man's unexpected death. But the new succession arrangement required Marcus to break this engagement and marry Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius. This was not a love match, but a political necessity, designed to strengthen the bonds between adoptive father and son. Marcus accepted these changes with characteristic grace, but they marked the end of his youth and the beginning of his preparation for the most demanding job in the world. From this point forward, every aspect of his life would be shaped by the knowledge that he was destined to rule. The philosophical education that had been a source of personal enrichment now became practical training for leadership. The moral principles he had learned in his grandfather's house would soon be tested on the stage of world history. The young man who had once dreamed of a life devoted to philosophy and contemplation now faced a different destiny. He would have to find a way to remain true to his principles while wielding power over millions of people. He would have to balance the competing demands of justice and necessity, wisdom and action, personal virtue and public responsibility. The next phase of his education would prepare him for these challenges, but nothing could fully prepare him for what lay ahead. Under the guidance of Antoninus Pius, Marcus entered the most intensive apprenticeship in leadership the world had ever seen. The new emperor was everything Hadrian had hoped for, a steady, competent ruler who would provide Marcus with the perfect model of how to wield power responsibly. Antoninus was called Pius, meaning dutiful or respectful, and he lived up to his name in every aspect of his reign. For the next 23 years, Marcus would watch and learn as Antoninus governed the empire with quiet efficiency. This was not the dramatic, attention-seeking leadership style of some emperors. Antoninus preferred to work behind the scenes, making careful decisions based on thorough analysis rather than grand gestures. He was a master of what we might call soft power, achieving his goals through consensus and respect rather than fear and intimidation. Marcus absorbed these lessons deeply. He attended Senate meetings, observing how his adoptive father navigated the complex web of Roman politics. He watched how Antoninus dealt with provincial governors, foreign ambassadors, and military commanders. Most importantly, he saw how a truly virtuous man could exercise absolute power without becoming corrupted by it. The education Marcus received during these years went far beyond politics and administration. Antoninus ensured that his heir continued his philosophical studies under the finest teachers available. Marcus studied with Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher who became perhaps his most influential mentor. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the writings of Epictetus, a former slave who had developed Stoic philosophy into a practical guide for daily living. Epictetus taught that we are like actors in a play. We don't choose our role, but we can choose how well we perform it. This metaphor resonated powerfully with Marcus, who was beginning to understand that his role as future emperor was not something he had chosen, but something he must accept and perform with excellence. The Stoic concept of amor fati, love of fate, became central to his worldview. Whatever life brings, we should not merely accept it, but embrace it as necessary for our growth and development. Marcus also studied under Alexander of Kotium, who taught him rhetoric and the art of public speaking. In an age before mass media, an emperor's ability to communicate effectively with soldiers, senators, and citizens could determine the success or failure of his reign. Alexander trained Marcus not just in the technical aspects of oratory, but in the deeper art of moving hearts and minds through words. But perhaps the most important teacher Marcus encountered during these years was Fronto, a master of Latin prose who became both mentor and friend. Their correspondence, much of which survives, reveals a relationship that went far beyond formal education. Fronto challenged Marcus intellectually while also providing emotional support during difficult periods. Their letters show Marcus wrestling with the tension between his philosophical ideals and the practical demands of preparing for leadership. Through Fronto, we see glimpses of Marcus the young man rather than just the future emperor. We see someone who struggled with self-doubt, who worried about living up to the expectations placed upon him, who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his destiny. In one letter, Marcus confesses to feeling like an imposter, unworthy of the role he has been given. Fronto's response is both reassuring and challenging, reminding his student that true worthiness comes not from feeling qualified, but from dedicating oneself completely to the task at hand. During this period, Marcus also began to develop his own philosophical voice through his private writings. What would later become known as his meditations started as personal notes, reminders to himself about how to live virtuously. These early writings reveal a young man grappling with fundamental questions about duty, mortality, and the nature of the good life. One theme that appears repeatedly in these early reflections is the tension between contemplation and action. Marcus was drawn to the philosophical life, the quiet pursuit of wisdom through study and reflection. But his destiny demanded active engagement with the messy, complicated world of politics and war. How could he reconcile these competing callings? How could he remain true to his philosophical principles while making the difficult decisions that leadership requires? The answer he developed would become the foundation of his mature philosophy. True wisdom, he concluded, is not found in withdrawal from the world, but in engaged participation, guided by virtue. The philosopher's duty is not to contemplate abstract truths in isolation, but to apply philosophical insights to real-world challenges. This was a radical departure from much of Greek philosophy, which often emphasized the superiority of contemplation over action. Marcus's apprenticeship was not limited to intellectual and philosophical training. Antoninus ensured that his heir gained practical experience in every aspect of governance. Marcus served as quaestor, praetor, and consul, working his way through the traditional ladder of Roman magistracies. He learned how the legal system worked, how taxes were collected, how public works were funded and managed. He studied military organization and strategy, for no Roman emperor could survive without the loyalty of the legions. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus learned the art of judgment. Day after day, he watched Antoninus make decisions that affected millions of lives. Should this governor be recalled for incompetence? Should these taxes be raised or lowered? Should the empire intervene in this foreign conflict? Every choice had consequences, often unintended ones. Marcus saw how even well-intentioned decisions could go wrong, how the complexity of governing such a vast empire made perfect solutions impossible. This experience taught him humility. He began to understand that leadership was not about having all the answers, but about making the best possible decisions with incomplete information under enormous pressure. The Stoic emphasis on focusing on what you can control while accepting what you cannot became, not just a philosophical principle, but a practical survival tool. As Marcus matured, those around him began to see the emergence of a remarkable leader. He possessed his grandfather's integrity and his adoptive father's practical wisdom, but he brought something unique to these inherited virtues. Marcus had a depth of philosophical reflection that was rare among men of action. He thought deeply about the moral implications of power, about the responsibility that came with authority, about the corrupting potential of absolute rule. His marriage to Faustina the Younger in 145 AD, when he was 24, marked another important milestone in his development. This union, arranged for political reasons, gradually became something deeper. Faustina proved to be not just a suitable empress, but a true partner who understood the unique pressures her husband faced. Their correspondence reveals genuine affection and mutual respect, a rare thing in aristocratic marriages of the time. The marriage also brought Marcus face to face with one of life's greatest joys and greatest vulnerabilities: parenthood. Faustina gave birth to their first child in 147 AD, and over the following years, they would have 13 children together. The experience of fatherhood profoundly shaped Marcus's philosophy, adding a new dimension to his understanding of love, loss, and human fragility. Watching his children grow, Marcus was struck by the preciousness and precariousness of human life. Children who seemed healthy could suddenly become ill and die. Those who survived faced an uncertain world filled with dangers he could not always protect them from. This intimate encounter with human vulnerability deepened his appreciation for Stoic teachings about the impermanence of all things and the importance of cherishing what we have while we have it. As the years passed, Marcus gradually took on more responsibilities within the imperial administration. Antoninus, now aging, began to rely more heavily on his heir's judgment and energy. Marcus found himself at the center of major policy decisions, military planning, and diplomatic negotiations. He was no longer just preparing to rule, he was beginning to rule in all but name. The transition was so gradual that many Romans hardly noticed it happening. This was exactly what Antoninus intended. By the time he died in 161 AD, Marcus had already been effectively governing the empire for several years. The succession would be smooth, with no power vacuum or political crisis to exploit. But as Marcus prepared to assume the title of emperor, he faced a moment of profound reckoning. All his preparation, all his philosophical study, all his careful apprenticeship was about to be put to the ultimate test. He was about to become the most powerful man on earth, with the authority to make life and death decisions for 60 million people. How would he handle this awesome responsibility? How would he avoid the corruption that had destroyed so many of his predecessors? The answers to these questions would define not only his reign, but his legacy. The young man who had once dreamed of a quiet life devoted to philosophy was about to discover whether virtue could survive at the pinnacle of worldly power. On March 7th, 161 AD, Antoninus Pius died peacefully in his bed at the age of 74. His last words, according to witnesses, were about the state of the empire and his concern for ensuring a smooth transition of power. Even in death, he remained focused on duty rather than himself. Marcus, now 39 years old, stood at the threshold of absolute power. The Roman Senate moved quickly to confirm the succession. There was no debate, no opposition, no political manoeuvring. After 23 years of careful preparation, Marcus Aurelius was acclaimed emperor with unanimous consent. It was a testament to both his character and the wisdom of Hadrian's original plan that the transition occurred without a single drop of blood being shed. But Marcus's first act as emperor revealed something unprecedented in Roman history. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be named co-emperor with equal authority. This was not mere political theatre or familial loyalty. Marcus genuinely believed that the empire was too vast and complex for one man to govern effectively. By sharing power voluntarily, he was breaking with centuries of Roman tradition that viewed imperial authority as indivisible. The decision shocked the political establishment. Roman emperors had occasionally named heirs or junior partners, but never had an emperor willingly divided supreme power with an equal. Many senators worried that this arrangement would lead to civil war, as competing loyalties tore the empire apart. Others suspected that Marcus was showing weakness, unable to handle the full burden of leadership. They were wrong on both counts. Marcus's decision to share power was not weakness but wisdom, not uncertainty but careful calculation. He understood that Lucius possessed military talents that complemented his own philosophical and administrative strengths. More importantly, he recognized that his Stoic principles demanded that he act for the good of the empire rather than for personal glory or traditional precedent. The partnership between Marcus and Lucius would prove to be one of the most effective governmental arrangements in Roman history. While Marcus focused on domestic administration, legal reform, and the complex business of governing 60 million people, Lucius took charge of military affairs and frontier defence. It was a division of labour that played to each man's strengths, while ensuring that no aspect of imperial responsibility was neglected. But the new emperor's philosophical convictions were immediately put to a severe test. The Antonine plague, a devastating epidemic that may have been smallpox or measles, began spreading throughout the empire in 166 AD. The disease had apparently been brought back by Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the east, and it spread with terrifying speed along the empire's excellent road system. Marcus watched helplessly as the plague ravaged his domain. Cities that had thrived for centuries were suddenly half empty. Trade collapsed as merchants refused to travel infected routes. The military struggled to maintain strength as soldiers died faster than they could be replaced. Some estimates suggest that the plague killed as much as 10% of the empire's population, a demographic catastrophe from which Rome would never fully recover. For a Stoic philosopher, the plague presented both a practical crisis and a profound test of faith. Stoicism taught that everything happens according to divine providence, that even apparent disasters serve some higher purpose in the cosmic order. But watching innocent people suffer and die on such a massive scale, Marcus struggled to maintain his philosophical equilibrium. His private writings from this period reveal a man wrestling with doubt and despair. How could a rational, benevolent universe permit such senseless suffering? What meaning could be found in the death of children who had barely begun to live. These were not abstract philosophical questions, but urgent personal struggles for someone who had built his entire worldview on Stoic principles. Yet Marcus refused to abandon his duties or retreat into cynical despair. Instead, he threw himself into the practical work of fighting the plague. He opened imperial granaries to feed the hungry, established hospitals for the sick, and used his personal fortune to fund relief efforts. When traditional physicians proved helpless against the disease, he supported experimental treatments and brought healers from across the empire to share their knowledge. Most remarkably, Marcus continued to hold court and conduct the business of government even as the plague raged around him. He could have retreated to some isolated palace and governed from a safe distance, but he chose to remain in Rome, visible and accessible to his people. This was leadership by example, showing through his actions that duty transcended personal safety. The plague also forced Marcus to confront one of the most difficult decisions of his reign. With the military weakened by disease and the frontiers increasingly threatened by barbarian incursions, should Rome adopt a defensive posture and consolidate its existing territory? Or should it continue the aggressive expansion that had characterized the empire for centuries? Marcus chose a middle path that reflected both Stoic wisdom and practical necessity. Rather than launching costly wars of conquest, he focused on strengthening existing defences and securing the frontiers through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. This was not the glamorous approach that had made heroes of previous emperors, but it was the responsible choice for an empire facing internal crisis. The decision revealed something crucial about Marcus's character as a leader. He was not driven by personal ambition or the desire for military glory. His goal was not to expand Roman power, but to preserve Roman civilization. This distinction would become increasingly important as his reign progressed and the challenges facing the empire multiplied. While dealing with the plague, Marcus also had to manage a serious military crisis on the eastern frontier. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, had invaded the Roman province of Armenia and was threatening Syria. This was exactly the kind of situation that required the military expertise of Lucius Verus, and Marcus dispatched his co-emperor to take personal command of the eastern campaign. The war against Parthia would last from 161 to 166 AD, and it would test every aspect of the dual emperor system. While Lucius commanded in the field, Marcus managed the complex logistics of supporting a major military campaign, while simultaneously dealing with domestic crises. The partnership worked brilliantly, with each emperor handling the responsibilities for which he was best suited. Lucius proved to be an effective military commander, winning several significant victories and ultimately forcing the Parthians to accept a humiliating peace treaty. Armenia was restored to Roman control, and several Parthian cities were sacked in retaliation for their aggression. By traditional Roman standards, the campaign was a complete success that enhanced the empire's prestige and demonstrated its continued military superiority. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The returning Roman legions brought the plague with them, spreading the disease throughout the western provinces. Moreover, Lucius himself fell ill during the campaign and died in 169 AD while returning to Rome. Marcus had lost not only his co-emperor and adoptive brother, but his closest friend and most trusted partner. The death of Lucius was a devastating personal blow for Marcus, but it also created a political crisis. The dual emperor system had worked precisely because both men were committed to cooperation rather than competition. Now Marcus faced the choice of either naming a new co-emperor or returning to the traditional model of sole rule. After much deliberation, Marcus chose to rule alone. This decision reflected both practical considerations and philosophical conviction. He had learned enough about governance to believe he could handle the full burden of leadership, and his Stoic principles taught him to accept the role that fate had assigned him. If the universe had decreed that he should rule alone, then he would embrace that responsibility completely. The transition back to sole rule marked a new phase in Marcus's development as both emperor and philosopher. No longer could he share the burden of difficult decisions or rely on Lucius's counsel in moments of doubt. Every choice, every policy, every crisis would rest solely on his shoulders. The weight of this responsibility was crushing, but it also clarified his sense of purpose. Marcus began to see his role as emperor in increasingly philosophical terms. He was not just a political leader or military commander, but a servant of the cosmic order, tasked with maintaining justice and reason in a chaotic world. This understanding would shape every aspect of his remaining years and transform him from a competent administrator into one of history's great moral exemplars. But even as he embraced this lofty vision of his duties, Marcus faced immediate practical challenges that would test his ideals against harsh realities. The northern frontiers were under increasing pressure from Germanic tribes seeking new lands and plunder. The economy was strained by the costs of plague relief and military campaigns. Social tensions were rising as traditional Roman values clashed with foreign influences. Most troubling of all, Marcus was beginning to realize that the empire he had inherited was not the stable, secure realm it appeared to be. Beneath the surface prosperity and military might, Rome was facing fundamental problems that could not be solved through traditional methods. The very success of the empire had created conditions that threatened its long-term survival. The next phase of Marcus's reign would force him to grapple with these deep structural challenges while maintaining his commitment to Stoic virtue. He would have to find ways to preserve Roman civilization without betraying his philosophical principles. The decisions he made during this period would determine not only his own legacy, but the future of the empire itself. As Marcus prepared for the trials ahead, he continued his practice of writing private reflections on the nature of duty, mortality, and the good life. These meditations, never intended for publication, reveal a man struggling to live up to impossible standards while bearing impossible burdens. They show us not a perfect philosopher king, but a deeply human figure wrestling with doubt, fear, and the crushing weight of responsibility. In one particularly revealing passage, Marcus writes about the loneliness of command, how the higher one rises, the fewer people one can trust with complete honesty. He reflects on how power isolates even as it empowers, creating a barrier between the ruler and those he serves. These are not the thoughts of someone drunk on authority, but of someone who understands its true cost. The stage was now set for the final act of Marcus's drama, the period that would test everything he had learned about leadership, philosophy, and the nature of human existence. The barbarian tribes were massing beyond the Danube. The empire's resources were stretched to their limits, and in the quiet of his private chambers, the emperor continued to write, seeking wisdom in the midst of an increasingly uncertain world. The crisis that would define the final chapter of Marcus Aurelius's reign began with disturbing reports from the northern frontier. Germanic tribes, driven by population pressure and environmental changes, were probing Roman defences along the Danube with increasing boldness. What started as isolated raids soon escalated into coordinated attacks by massive tribal confederations. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians had formed an unprecedented alliance, threatening to overwhelm the thinly stretched Roman garrisons. Marcus faced a decision that would shape the remainder of his life. He could delegate command to his generals and remain in the comfortable palaces of Rome, managing the crisis from a distance. Most emperors would have chosen this path, content to let others bear the physical dangers of frontier warfare. But Marcus's philosophical convictions demanded a different response. If duty called him to the battlefield, then to the battlefield he would go. In the spring of 170 AD, Marcus Aurelius left Rome for what he believed would be a brief military campaign. He could not have imagined that he would spend the next decade of his life on the frontier, waging a brutal war against enemies who seemed to multiply with each passing season. The man who had devoted his youth to contemplating eternal truths was about to discover that philosophy's greatest test comes not in academic debate, but in the mud and blood of real conflict. The journey north was a revelation in itself. As the imperial entourage travelled through the provinces, Marcus saw firsthand the devastation wrought by plague and barbarian raids. Entire towns stood abandoned, their populations fled or dead. Fields lay fallow for lack of farmers to work them. The prosperity that had defined the Antonine age was crumbling before his eyes. But Marcus also witnessed something that renewed his faith in human nature. In village after village, he encountered ordinary Romans who had refused to abandon their homes despite overwhelming odds. Farmers who continued to plant crops even as raiders threatened their harvests. Soldiers who maintained their posts though reinforcements might never come. Citizens who cared for plague victims at the risk of their own lives. These encounters deepened Marcus's understanding of Stoic virtue. Courage, he realized, was not the exclusive province of philosophers and emperors. The greatest examples of heroism often came from people who had never read a philosophical text, but who intuitively understood what duty required. The mother who stayed with her sick child, the soldier who held his ground against impossible odds, the merchant who shared his grain with starving neighbours. These were the true philosophers, living virtue through action rather than contemplation. When Marcus finally reached the Danube frontier in late 170 AD, he found a military situation far worse than reports had suggested. The barbarian confederation had achieved something unprecedented in Roman experience. They had learned to coordinate their attacks across hundreds of miles of frontier, striking simultaneously at multiple points to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their defences. More troubling still, these were not the disorganised tribal raiders of earlier centuries. The Germanic peoples had been observing Roman military techniques for generations, learning from their defeats and adapting their tactics accordingly. They had developed sophisticated siege equipment, disciplined infantry formations, and effective cavalry units. They were becoming, in effect, barbarian Romans, combining their natural ferocity with borrowed military science. The first major engagement of what would become known as the Marcomannic Wars took place near the Roman fortress of Carnuntum. Marcus, despite having no formal military training beyond what was required of Roman aristocrats, insisted on personally commanding the imperial forces. His generals were appalled. No emperor had led troops in actual combat for over a century. The risks were enormous, both to Marcus personally and to the stability of the empire. But Marcus was unmoved by their objections. How could he ask soldiers to die for Rome while he remained safely in the rear? How could he speak of duty and sacrifice from a position of comfort and security? His Stoic principles demanded that he share the dangers he imposed on others. If philosophy meant anything, it meant accepting the consequences of one's convictions. The battle was a disaster. The barbarians had chosen their ground carefully, using the terrain to negate Rome's advantages in heavy infantry and siege equipment. Marcus watched in horror as entire cohorts were surrounded and annihilated. The famous Roman discipline that had conquered the Mediterranean world seemed helpless against enemies who fought with desperate fury for their very survival. As night fell over the battlefield, strewn with Roman dead, Marcus faced the darkest moment of his reign. He had led his army into catastrophe through inexperience and overconfidence. Thousands of soldiers had died because their emperor had prioritized philosophical principles over military prudence. The barbarians had won a victory that would encourage every enemy of Rome from Britain to Syria. That night, alone in his command tent, Marcus wrote some of his most powerful meditations on failure and resilience. He reflected on how quickly fortune could change, how the confident plans of morning could become evening's catastrophic ruins. But rather than descending into despair, he found in this defeat a deeper understanding of Stoic acceptance. The universe had tested him and found him wanting. His task now was to learn from failure and continue forward. The defeat at Carnuntum marked the beginning of Marcus's true education in warfare. He spent the following months studying every aspect of military science with the same intensity he had once devoted to philosophy. He consulted with veteran centurions, analysed barbarian tactics, and gradually developed a new approach to frontier defence that combined Roman discipline with flexible adaptation to local conditions. More importantly, Marcus learned to delegate military operations to competent subordinates while focusing on the broader strategic and logistical challenges of sustaining a long campaign. He discovered that his philosophical training, rather than being irrelevant to warfare, actually provided valuable insights into leadership under extreme pressure. The Stoic emphasis on emotional control proved invaluable when making life and death decisions. The practice of viewing events from a cosmic perspective helped him maintain strategic focus amid the chaos of daily crises. The war settled into a grinding pattern of advance and retreat, victory and defeat that would define the remainder of Marcus's life. Unlike the swift campaigns of earlier Roman conquests, the Marcomannic wars required a different kind of leadership. This was not about glorious battles and dramatic victories, but about the patient work of wearing down determined enemies through superior organisation and resources. Marcus established his headquarters at various frontier fortresses, moving from crisis to crisis as barbarian pressure shifted along the extended frontier. His court became itinerant, following the emperor from one muddy camp to another. Roman aristocrats who had expected comfortable sinecures found themselves sharing the hardships of common soldiers. The marble halls of the Palatine seemed like memories from another world. It was during this period that Marcus began writing what would become his greatest philosophical legacy. In the quiet hours between military conferences and administrative duties, he reflected on the nature of existence, duty, and human suffering. These meditations were never intended for publication. They were private conversations between Marcus and his own soul, attempts to maintain philosophical equilibrium amid the chaos of war. The writings reveal a man struggling to reconcile his idealistic vision of Stoic virtue with the brutal realities of governing an empire under siege. How does one maintain compassion while ordering the execution of prisoners? How does one speak of universal brotherhood while waging war against barbarian tribes? How does one find meaning in a world that seems determined to destroy everything good and beautiful? Marcus's answers to these questions evolved throughout the campaign. Initially, he clung to abstract philosophical principles, seeking to apply theoretical wisdom to practical problems. But gradually, his thinking became more nuanced and complex. He began to understand that true philosophy required not rigid adherence to doctrine, but flexible wisdom that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. The emperor's presence on the frontier had an unexpected effect on Roman morale. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to emperors who ruled from distant palaces were inspired by a leader who shared their dangers and hardships. Marcus ate the same rations, slept in similar quarters, and exposed himself to the same risks as his men. When plague struck the army camps, he remained among the sick rather than fleeing to safety. This leadership style gradually began to turn the tide of war. Roman forces, inspired by their emperor's example, fought with renewed determination. The barbarian confederation, faced with an enemy that refused to break under pressure, began to fragment as individual tribes sought separate peace agreements. The careful coordination that had made their initial attack so successful gave way to the familiar pattern of internecine warfare that Romans had always exploited. But victory came at enormous personal cost to Marcus. The years of campaign life had aged him prematurely. The man who had once been known for his vigorous health now suffered from chronic illnesses that he refused to let interfere with his duties. His hair had gone completely grey, his face was deeply lined, and his once powerful frame had become gaunt from the rigours of frontier life. Even more painful was the personal grief he endured during these years. News reached the frontier camps of deaths in his family. Several of his children died during his absence, victims of plague or other diseases that ravaged the capital. Each loss was a dagger to his heart, but duty demanded that he remain at his post rather than returning to Rome to mourn properly. The death of his son Verus in 169 AD was particularly devastating. Marcus had hoped that this boy might eventually share the burdens of imperial rule, providing the kind of partnership he had enjoyed with Lucius Verus. Instead, he received word of the child's death through a dispatch from Rome, learning of his loss in the same way he learned of military casualties and administrative problems. Marcus's response to these personal tragedies reveals the depth of his philosophical development. Rather than becoming bitter or cynical, he found in suffering a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of life and love. His meditations from this period contain some of the most moving reflections on mortality and loss in ancient literature. He writes of cherishing what we have while we have it, of finding meaning in temporary joys even while accepting their inevitable end. The war dragged on year after year, testing not only Marcus's military leadership, but his ability to maintain the complex administrative machinery that kept the empire functioning. From his frontier headquarters, he continued to govern 60 million people, making decisions about taxation, legal disputes, religious policies, and diplomatic relations. The burden was crushing, but he refused to delegate responsibilities that he believed required imperial authority. During the winter months, when active campaigning was impossible, Marcus often retreated to the comparative quiet of established fortresses where he could focus on writing and reflection. It was during one such winter, probably in 173 or 174 AD, that he wrote some of his most famous meditations on the nature of leadership and the corrupting potential of power. He reflected on how easy it would be to become hardened by years of making life and death decisions, how the constant exercise of absolute authority could transform even well-intentioned rulers into tyrants. He wrote about the importance of remembering one's humanity, of treating even the humblest subject with dignity and respect. These were not abstract philosophical exercises, but urgent reminders to himself about how to remain virtuous under circumstances that destroyed weaker men. The emperor's commitment to justice became legendary among both Romans and barbarians. Stories spread of his refusal to execute prisoners without proper trial, his insistence on fair treatment for captured enemies, his attempts to negotiate peaceful settlements whenever possible. These actions were not always popular with his own troops, who often preferred the traditional Roman approach of devastating conquered territories as an example to others. But Marcus understood that his actions as emperor would outlast his victories or defeats. Future generations would judge him not by how many enemies he killed, but by how he used his power. The Stoic concept of the ideal sage, the perfectly virtuous person who remained unmoved by external circumstances, provided a standard against which he constantly measured his own conduct. As the war entered its final phase in the mid-170s AD, Marcus achieved a series of decisive victories that effectively ended the barbarian threat for a generation. The tribal confederation collapsed, its leaders either dead or willing to accept Roman terms. The Danube frontier was secured, and the immediate danger to the empire's heartland was eliminated. But Marcus understood that he had won only a temporary reprieve. The underlying pressures that had driven the barbarian invasions remained unchanged. Population growth, climate change, and the attraction of Roman wealth would continue to draw tribal peoples toward the empire's borders. The next generation of Roman leaders would face similar challenges, and Marcus had no assurance that they would prove equal to the task. It was this recognition that prompted one of the most controversial decisions of his reign. Rather than simply defeating the barbarian tribes and driving them back beyond the Danube, Marcus considered a radical alternative. He began planning to incorporate large numbers of barbarians directly into the Roman military and civilian population, essentially expanding the empire's human resources by absorbing its former enemies. This policy of large-scale barbarian settlement was unprecedented in Roman history and deeply controversial among traditional Romans who viewed non-citizens as inherently inferior and dangerous. But Marcus's philosophical convictions led him to believe that virtue and intelligence were not limited by birth or ethnicity. If barbarians could be educated in Roman law and customs, if they could be given stakes in the empire's prosperity, they might become valuable citizens rather than perpetual enemies. The emperor began implementing this policy on a limited scale, settling defeated tribal groups in sparsely populated regions of the empire where they could be gradually integrated into Roman society. The experiment would continue long after his death and would eventually transform the very nature of Roman civilization. But in his lifetime, Marcus could only hope that his successors would have the wisdom to continue policies that prioritized long-term stability over short-term military glory. As the decade of warfare drew to a close, Marcus found himself fundamentally changed by the experience. The young man who had once dreamed of a life devoted to philosophical contemplation had been forged into something harder and more complex. He had learned that true wisdom comes not from avoiding difficult choices, but from making them with full awareness of their moral weight. He had discovered that virtue tested in the crucible of real conflict is far more valuable than virtue that exists only in comfortable abstraction. But the years of campaigning had also taken a terrible toll. Marcus was now in his 50s, old by the standards of his time, and his health was failing. The chronic illnesses that had plagued him throughout the campaign were worsening, and he knew that his time was limited. The question that haunted his final years was whether he had done enough to secure the empire's future, and whether his philosophical legacy would survive the inevitable corruptions of political power. As Marcus approached his 60th year, the weight of command had transformed him into something his younger self could never have imagined. The philosopher who had once sought truth in the quiet gardens of academic debate now found wisdom in the harsh realities of imperial responsibility. Yet even as his body weakened under the relentless strain of frontier warfare, his mind remained as sharp as ever, perhaps sharpened by the very trials that were destroying his physical strength. The emperor's daily routine during these final years reveals a man driven by an almost superhuman sense of duty. He would rise before dawn, spending the first hours in private meditation and writing, the only time when the demands of empire allowed him solitude. These pre-dawn moments became sacred to him, a chance to center himself before confronting another day of impossible decisions and crushing responsibilities. As the sun rose over the military camps scattered along the Danube, Marcus would emerge from his quarters to begin the endless round of conferences, consultations, and commands that defined imperial leadership. He met with generals planning the next phase of operations, with engineers designing fortifications, with diplomats negotiating with tribal chieftains, with administrators managing the complex logistics of keeping armies supplied hundreds of miles from Roman supply bases. But what struck those who served with him was not the emperor's mastery of military details or administrative procedures. It was his unwavering commitment to treating every person who came before him with dignity and respect. Whether dealing with a veteran centurion or a captured barbarian warrior, Marcus brought the same careful attention and moral consideration to each encounter. He had learned to see past rank and status to the essential humanity that connected all people. This philosophical approach to leadership created unexpected results on the battlefield. Roman soldiers, accustomed to emperors who viewed them as expendable tools of policy, found themselves serving a leader who genuinely cared about their welfare. Marcus instituted new policies to improve medical care for wounded troops, established funds to support the families of fallen soldiers, and made regular visits to field hospitals, where he spoke personally with injured men. The barbarian tribes, too, began to respond differently to Roman authority under Marcus's leadership. Instead of the usual cycle of conquest and rebellion that had characterized frontier relations for centuries, many tribal groups began seeking accommodation with an emperor who demonstrated that Roman power could be exercised with justice rather than mere brutality. Surrender became preferable to annihilation when the Romans offered genuine integration rather than slavery or death. Yet Marcus never allowed this humanitarian approach to compromise military effectiveness. When tribes violated agreements or attacked Roman civilians, his response was swift and devastating. The emperor who showed mercy to defeated enemies could be utterly ruthless toward those who betrayed his trust. This combination of justice and strength became his signature as a military leader, earning him respect from both allies and adversaries. The psychological toll of these years cannot be underestimated. Marcus was fighting not just external enemies, but internal doubts about whether his philosophical ideals could survive the moral compromises that leadership demanded. Every execution order, every decision to sacrifice one group for another's benefit, every calculated betrayal of allies who had become inconvenient tested his commitment to Stoic virtue. His private writings from this period reveal a man walking a tightrope between cynicism and naive idealism. He struggled constantly with questions that had no easy answers. How many deaths could be justified to prevent greater suffering? When did pragmatic compromise become moral corruption? How could he maintain his humanity while exercising the kind of power that seemed to dehumanize everyone who wielded it? The answers Marcus developed were not the clean, abstract principles of academic philosophy, but the messy, practical wisdom of someone who had been forced to apply moral reasoning to impossible situations. He learned to accept that perfect solutions rarely exist, that leadership often requires choosing between competing goods rather than between good and evil. The key was to make these choices consciously, with full awareness of their moral weight, rather than drifting into decisions through carelessness or self-deception. During the winter of 176 AD, Marcus received news that would fundamentally alter the final chapter of his life. His son Commodus, now 15 years old, had been named Caesar and designated as his heir. The decision was not entirely Marcus's own. The Senate and the army had been pressing for a clear succession plan as the emperor's health continued to decline. But Marcus had mixed feelings about elevating a son who had shown troubling signs of the arrogance and cruelty that had characterized so many imperial heirs. The relationship between Marcus and Commodus was complicated by the very different circumstances of their upbringings. Where Marcus had been raised by a grandfather who emphasized virtue and duty, Commodus had grown up in the imperial court, surrounded by flatterers who told him he was superior to ordinary mortals simply by virtue of his birth. Where Marcus had been forced to earn respect through demonstrated competence and character, Commodus expected deference as his natural right. Marcus attempted to counter these influences by bringing his son to the frontier for first-hand experience of military command. He hoped that exposure to the realities of warfare and governance would mature the young man, teaching him the same lessons that had shaped his own character. But Commodus showed little interest in the philosophical discussions that had sustained his father through the darkest moments of the campaign. Instead, the young Caesar gravitated toward the more glamorous aspects of imperial power. He was fascinated by gladiatorial combat, spending hours watching training sessions and even participating in mock battles himself. He enjoyed the ceremony and spectacle of imperial audiences, the way crowds fell silent when he entered a room, the immediate obedience his slightest gesture commanded. These were precisely the aspects of power that Marcus had learned to view with suspicion and restraint. The contrast between father and son became a source of increasing concern for those who served in the imperial administration. Marcus's closest advisors began to worry about what would happen to the empire when a man of Commodus's temperament inherited absolute authority. But their concerns had to be expressed carefully, for criticizing the designated heir was tantamount to treason. Marcus himself was painfully aware of his son's limitations, but he felt trapped by the logic of dynastic succession. The empire needed stability, and naming a successor from outside the imperial family would likely trigger civil war among competing claimants. Better a flawed heir who could maintain continuity than a power vacuum that might destroy everything Marcus had worked to preserve. This dilemma tormented Marcus during his final years. He had spent his entire life trying to embody the ideal of the Philosopher King, proving that wisdom and power could be combined without corruption. But his son seemed destined to become exactly the kind of tyrant that Plato had warned against, someone who would use imperial authority for personal gratification rather than public service. The emperor's response to this crisis was characteristically thoughtful and systematic. He began drafting detailed instructions for his successor, covering everything from military strategy to administrative procedures to philosophical principles of governance. These documents, never intended for public circulation, reveal Marcus's desperate hope that written guidance might compensate for what personal example had failed to achieve. At the same time, Marcus intensified his efforts to strengthen the institutional constraints on imperial power. He expanded the authority of the Senate in certain areas, established new procedures for reviewing imperial decisions, and created advisory councils that future emperors would find difficult to ignore. His goal was to build safeguards into the system that might prevent a tyrannical ruler from doing too much damage. But even as he worked on these practical measures, Marcus knew that institutions alone could not guarantee virtuous leadership. The Roman system was fundamentally dependent on the character of whoever held supreme power, and no constitutional arrangements could completely restrain an emperor determined to abuse his authority. The best he could do was hope that his son might eventually mature into wisdom, or that circumstances might force Commodus to govern more responsibly than his character suggested. The final years of the Marcomannic Wars tested Marcus's physical endurance to its absolute limits. The chronic illnesses that had plagued him throughout the campaign were now accompanied by what appears to have been stomach cancer, causing constant pain that he endured without complaint. His physicians urged him to return to Rome for treatment, but he refused to abandon his post while active operations continued. Those who served closest to the emperor during this period were amazed by his ability to function normally despite obvious suffering. He continued to rise before dawn for his private meditations, attended all necessary military conferences, and maintained his usual schedule of personal audiences for soldiers and civilians seeking imperial justice. Only the most observant noticed the occasional grimace of pain or the way he sometimes paused to steady himself when he thought no one was watching. Marcus's determination to remain at his post was not mere stubbornness, but reflected his deep conviction that leadership required sharing the hardships of those one commanded. How could he ask soldiers to endure the discomforts and dangers of frontier warfare while he retreated to the luxury of Roman palaces? How could he speak of duty and sacrifice from a position of comfort and safety? This commitment to leading by example had profound effects on army morale during the final phase of the wars. Roman soldiers, seeing their emperor continue to function despite obvious illness, found new reserves of strength for their own trials. The barbarian tribes, observing that their principal enemy refused to show weakness even in extremity, began to lose hope that time would solve their problems for them. As spring arrived in 177 AD, Marcus launched what he intended to be the final campaign of the war. The remaining barbarian resistance was concentrated in a few strongholds beyond the Danube, and he was determined to eliminate these threats before returning to Rome. The operation was carefully planned and methodically executed, demonstrating the military expertise that Marcus had acquired through years of hard experience. But the emperor's body was finally reaching the limits of its endurance. During the siege of a barbarian fortress, Marcus collapsed while inspecting defensive preparations. His physicians, who had been monitoring his condition with growing alarm, insisted that he be evacuated immediately to a more secure location where they could provide proper medical care. Marcus agreed to withdraw to the Roman fortress at Vindobona, modern Vienna, but only after ensuring that the military situation was stable enough to proceed without his direct supervision. Even as his strength ebbed, his primary concern remained the welfare of his soldiers and the security of the empire's borders. The journey to Vindobona was agony for Marcus, but he insisted on stopping frequently to address troops and meet with local commanders. These final public appearances revealed a man whose physical body was failing, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Soldiers who had served under him for years were moved to tears by the sight of their emperor's determination to fulfill his duties despite obvious suffering. At Vindobona, Marcus established what would become his final headquarters. The fortress was well positioned to monitor the frontier situation while providing the medical facilities and administrative support that the imperial court required. But everyone understood that this was not a temporary arrangement. The emperor had come here to die. Yet even in his final months, Marcus continued to govern with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his entire reign. He reviewed legal cases, made appointments to provincial offices, and supervised the ongoing negotiations with barbarian tribes seeking peace agreements. The business of empire could not wait for his convenience, and he would not allow personal suffering to interfere with public responsibilities. During the long winter nights at Vindobona, Marcus returned to the philosophical writing that had sustained him throughout the campaign years. His final meditations, written with hands weakened by illness and pain, contain some of his most profound insights into the nature of mortality and the meaning of human existence. He reflected on the approach of death not with fear, but with the curiosity of a philosopher examining a new experience. These final writings reveal a man who had achieved a rare form of peace. Marcus had tested his philosophical convictions against the harshest realities of power and found them not wanting, but deepened. He had learned that virtue is not a theoretical concept, but a practical discipline that must be renewed every day through conscious choice and deliberate action. As winter gave way to spring in 180 AD, Marcus could feel his strength finally ebbing away. The cancer was spreading, and his physicians could do nothing more than manage his pain. But rather than retreating into self-pity or despair, the emperor used his remaining time to prepare for a death that would be as philosophical as his life had been. The final act was approaching, and Marcus Aurelius was ready to meet it with the same courage and dignity that had defined his extraordinary journey from privileged youth to philosopher emperor. The morning of March 17th, 180 AD, dawned cold and grey over the fortress at Vindobona. Marcus Aurelius woke before sunrise, as he had every day for decades, but this time the effort of rising from his bed left him breathless and trembling. His body, ravaged by months of illness, could barely support its own weight. Yet his mind remained clear, perhaps sharpened by the proximity of death into a final crystalline focus. His personal secretary, who had served him faithfully throughout the frontier campaigns, found the emperor already dressed and seated at his writing desk. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of 60 million people was putting the finishing touches on what would be his final meditation. The words he wrote that morning would outlive empires. Death is not evil, but simply the completion of life's natural cycle. What matters is not how long we live, but how virtuously we have used the time given to us. The news of Marcus's condition had spread throughout the fortress during the night. Soldiers who had fought beside their emperor for nearly a decade gathered in the courtyard below his quarters. Their faces etched with grief they dared not express aloud. These hardened veterans of countless battles had seen death in every imaginable form, but the thought of losing the leader who had shared their dangers and earned their devotion reduced them to silent mourning. Commodus arrived from Rome within hours of receiving word of his father's deteriorating condition. The 20-year-old Caesar brought with him a retinue of courtiers and advisors who seemed almost obscene in their silk robes and perfumed luxury amid the stark functionality of the military camp. The contrast between father and son had never been more apparent than in this moment when imperial power was about to pass from one generation to the next. The meeting between Marcus and Commodus was private, conducted in the emperor's Spartan quarters, with only the most trusted advisors present. Those who witnessed it later described a conversation that was both tender and tragic. Marcus, despite his physical weakness, made one final attempt to impress upon his son the weight of responsibility that came with imperial authority. He spoke of the empire not as a possession to be enjoyed, but as a trust to be preserved. He reminded Commodus of the millions of people whose welfare would depend on his decisions, of the soldiers who would follow his orders into battle, of the delicate balance between justice and necessity that every emperor must maintain. These were lessons Marcus had learned through decades of painful experience, wisdom purchased with suffering and sacrifice. But even as he spoke, Marcus could see that his words were not truly penetrating his son's consciousness. Commodus listened respectfully, nodded at appropriate moments, even asked thoughtful questions. But there was something hollow in his responses, a sense that he was performing the role of dutiful son rather than genuinely absorbing his father's counsel. The young man's attention seemed to drift toward the ceremony of succession, the pageantry of power, rather than its moral dimensions. The emperor's closest advisors watched this exchange with growing dread. They had hoped that the proximity of death might somehow transform Commodus, awakening in him the wisdom and compassion that had defined his father's reign. Instead, they saw a young man eager to claim his inheritance, but reluctant to accept its burdens. The future of the empire hung in the balance of this conversation, and that future looked increasingly dark. As evening approached, Marcus summoned his senior commanders for a final military conference. The business of defending the frontier could not wait for his death, and he was determined to ensure a smooth transition of authority. His voice, though weakened by illness, still carried the authority that had commanded respect from generals and barbarian chieftains alike. He reviewed the current military situation with characteristic precision, identifying potential threats and outlining strategic responses. The barbarian tribes remained quiet for now, but Marcus warned that this peace was fragile and temporary. Future emperors would need to maintain constant vigilance, balancing military strength with diplomatic wisdom. The empire's survival depended on leaders who understood that true security came not from conquest, but from justice. The conference concluded with Marcus formally transferring military command to Commodus in the presence of the assembled officers. It was a moment heavy with symbolism and foreboding. The soldiers pledged their loyalty to the new Caesar with the traditional acclamations, but their enthusiasm seemed forced. They were professional enough to recognize legitimate authority, but their hearts remained with the dying emperor who had earned their devotion through shared hardship. That night, Marcus experienced what his physicians recognized as a final rally, a temporary improvement that sometimes preceded death. He used these precious hours to complete his personal correspondence, writing final letters to friends and colleagues across the empire. Each message was carefully crafted, offering wisdom, encouragement, or practical advice suited to the recipient's circumstances. So, to the Senate, he wrote a formal letter reviewing the major challenges facing the empire and recommending policies for addressing them. To provincial governors, he sent specific instructions about local issues that required imperial attention. To old friends from his philosophical studies, he offered reflections on the meaning of their shared journey through life. These letters reveal a mind still fully engaged with the world despite the body's collapse. But perhaps the most poignant correspondence was addressed to his surviving children. Marcus had watched too many of his sons and daughters die young, victims of plague and disease that no amount of imperial power could prevent. To those who remained, he wrote with the tender authority of a father who would soon be gone forever. He urged them to live virtuously, to remember their duties to others, and to find strength in philosophy when the inevitable trials of life overwhelmed them. The emperor also used these final hours to complete his arrangements for the peaceful transfer of power. He had learned from history that imperial successions often triggered civil wars as rival claimants fought for the throne. His goal was to make Commodus's authority so clearly legitimate that no general or senator would dare challenge it. The stability of the empire depended on avoiding the chaos that had destroyed previous dynasties. Marcus met privately with each of his senior advisors, extracting promises that they would serve his son with the same loyalty they had shown him. He knew that Commodus would need experienced counselors to compensate for his own inexperience and questionable judgment. These men represented the institutional memory of effective governance, and their cooperation would be essential during the dangerous transition period. The emperor also made financial arrangements to ensure the army's continued loyalty. Military revolts often began when soldiers' pay was delayed or reduced, and Marcus had no intention of leaving his son vulnerable to such problems. He authorized generous bonuses for the frontier troops and established funds to guarantee their compensation even during potential future crises. As dawn broke on March 18th, Marcus felt his strength finally beginning to ebb beyond recovery. The brief rally of the previous day had exhausted his remaining reserves, and his physicians could no longer hide their conviction that the end was imminent. But the emperor faced his mortality with the same philosophical composure that had characterized his entire reign. He requested that his personal effects be brought to him so that he could make final dispositions. The accumulated treasures of decades of imperial rule were distributed with characteristic generosity. Valuable items went to loyal servants, military decorations to deserving soldiers, books to scholars who would appreciate them. Marcus retained only his writing materials and a simple ring that had belonged to his grandfather, the man who had first taught him about virtue and duty. The emperor's final public appearance came when he insisted on addressing the troops one last time. Too weak to stand without support, he was carried to a balcony overlooking the fortress courtyard, where thousands of soldiers had assembled. His voice, though barely above a whisper, somehow carried to every corner of the gathering as he delivered what amounted to a farewell address. He spoke of the honour he had felt in serving alongside such men, of the victories they had won together, and of the peace they had secured for the empire's citizens. He reminded them that their duty extended beyond any individual emperor to the Roman people themselves, who depended on their courage and discipline for protection. These soldiers were not merely instruments of imperial will, but guardians of civilization itself. Most movingly, Marcus apologized for the hardships he had imposed during the long years of frontier warfare. He acknowledged that his decisions had cost many of them friends and comrades, that his strategic choices had sometimes led to unnecessary suffering, but he asked them to remember that every sacrifice had been made in service of something larger than themselves, something worthy of their devotion. The emperor concluded by formally commending them to Commodus's service, asking them to show his son the same loyalty and respect they had given him. It was both a request and a command, delivered with the moral authority of a leader who had earned the right to make such demands. The soldiers responded with a thunderous acclamation that echoed off the fortress walls, a final tribute to the man who had shared their dangers and honoured their service. After this emotional farewell, Marcus retreated to his private quarters for the last time. He had said everything that needed to be said, made every arrangement that duty required. Now he could focus on the purely personal task of preparing his soul for the journey that lay ahead. Death, according to Stoic teaching, was not an enemy to be feared, but a natural transition that every rational being must eventually accept. The emperor spent his final afternoon in quiet conversation with his closest friends and family members. These were not formal audiences, but intimate gatherings where the mask of imperial dignity could finally be set aside. Marcus spoke freely about his hopes and fears, his regrets and satisfactions, his wonder at the strange journey that had brought him from philosophical student to ruler of the world. To those who grieved at his approaching death, he offered comfort drawn from decades of philosophical reflection. The soul, he reminded them, was immortal and would continue its existence in whatever form the cosmic order required. Their tears were natural and even appropriate, but they should not let sorrow blind them to the beauty and meaning that life continued to offer. His death was not a tragedy, but the completion of a pattern that had meaning within the larger design of the universe. As evening shadows lengthened across the fortress, Marcus asked to be left alone for his final meditation. He had begun this practice as a young man studying philosophy in Rome's gardens, and he would end it as an old emperor dying on a distant frontier. The circle was closing with a symmetry that would have pleased the Stoic masters, who had taught him to see patterns and purpose in apparent chaos. The emperor's last written words, discovered by his secretary the following morning, were characteristically philosophical and surprisingly peaceful. He reflected on the privilege of having lived during humanity's greatest age, of having witnessed the empire at its height of power and prosperity. He expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve something larger than himself, to have played a small part in the vast drama of human civilization. But perhaps most remarkably, Marcus wrote about his hope for the future, despite his concerns about his son's character. He had learned to trust in the fundamental rationality of the universe, to believe that even apparent disasters served some higher purpose. If Commodus proved unworthy of the throne, if the empire declined under his rule, perhaps that too was part of a pattern too large for any individual to comprehend. Marcus Aurelius died peacefully in his sleep during the early hours of March 19th, 180 AD. His passing was so gentle that the servants keeping watch in the adjoining chamber did not realize he was gone until they came to wake him for his morning routine. The man who had spent his final years surrounded by the violence and chaos of war found in death the tranquility that had sometimes eluded him in life. News of the emperor's death spread through the fortress with the speed of wildfire. Soldiers who had maintained stern discipline throughout the campaign wept openly at the loss of their beloved commander. Officers who had served under previous emperors declared they had never known a leader who combined such strength with such humanity. Even the barbarian hostages held in the fortress expressed genuine grief at the passing of an enemy who had treated them with unexpected honour. The immediate succession proceeded exactly as Marcus had planned. Commodus was acclaimed emperor by the assembled troops without opposition or delay. The institutional arrangements Marcus had established ensured a smooth transfer of authority that avoided the chaos and bloodshed that often accompanied imperial transitions. But those who had known both father and son could not escape the feeling that something precious had died with Marcus Aurelius. The emperor's body was prepared for its final journey to Rome, according to traditional Roman customs. But even in death, Marcus received honours that reflected the unique respect he had earned. Veterans of the frontier campaigns volunteered to serve as honour guards, considering it the highest privilege to escort their fallen commander home. Provincial officials and tribal chieftains who had negotiated with the living emperor came to pay their respects to his memory. The funeral procession that carried Marcus Aurelius back to Rome was unlike any the empire had ever seen. At every town and city along the route, crowds gathered to witness the passage of the philosopher emperor who had ruled them with such wisdom and justice. Rich and poor alike lined the roads, throwing flowers and weeping for a leader whose death seemed to mark the end of an era. In Rome itself, the Senate decreed honours that surpassed even those given to Augustus, the empire's founder. Marcus was declared a god, his name added to the roll of deified emperors whose spirits protected the Roman people. But more significantly, he was remembered as the last of the good emperors, the final ruler who had successfully combined absolute power with absolute virtue. The funeral ceremonies in the capital lasted for days, drawing representatives from every corner of the empire. Philosophers delivered eulogies that compared Marcus to the greatest sages of antiquity. Soldiers recounted his courage on the battlefield and his care for their welfare. Citizens testified to his justice and his accessibility to even the humblest petitioners. The man was buried, but the legend was born. Yet even as Rome mourned its greatest emperor, thoughtful observers recognized that his death represented more than the loss of an individual leader. Marcus Aurelius had embodied an ideal of enlightened rule that seemed unlikely to survive his passing. The very qualities that had made him beloved, his philosophical detachment and moral restraint, were precisely those that modern circumstances seem to discourage. The empire Marcus left behind was still the most powerful political entity on earth, but it faced challenges that no amount of virtue could easily solve. The economic strain of constant warfare was weakening the fiscal foundations of imperial government. Barbarian pressure on the frontiers was intensifying as tribal populations grew and climate changes forced migrations. Social tensions were rising as traditional Roman values clashed with foreign influences imported through conquest and trade. Most ominously, the military was becoming increasingly dominant in imperial politics. The frontier armies that had saved the empire under Marcus's leadership were also developing an independence that threatened civilian authority. Future emperors would find themselves dependent on military support in ways that compromised their ability to govern according to law and justice rather than force and expedience. Commodus inherited these problems along with his father's throne, but he lacked both the wisdom and the character necessary to address them effectively. Within months of his accession, the new emperor was demonstrating exactly the kind of behaviour that Marcus had feared. The carefully constructed system of checks and balances that had constrained imperial power began to crumble under pressure from a ruler who viewed authority as a personal plaything rather than a public trust. The contrast between father and son became painfully apparent as Commodus abandoned the frontier policies that had secured peace in favour of spectacular entertainments designed to win popular approval in Rome. The disciplined administration that Marcus had built was replaced by a court culture of flattery and corruption. The philosophical advisors who had guided imperial policy were dismissed in favour of gladiators and chariot racers who shared the emperor's taste for violent spectacle. Yet even as the empire began its long decline under Commodus's misrule, the memory of Marcus Aurelius continued to inspire those who believed in the possibility of virtuous leadership. His private writings, discovered after his death and eventually published as the Meditations, provided a roadmap for anyone seeking to live with integrity under difficult circumstances. The philosopher emperor had left behind something more durable than political institutions or military victories. The ideas Marcus had wrestled with during his final years on the Danube frontier would outlive the empire itself. His vision of leadership as service rather than domination, his commitment to justice even when expedience suggested otherwise, his belief that true strength came from self-mastery rather than the conquest of others, these principles would inspire future generations long after Rome itself had fallen. In the end, Marcus Aurelius achieved a form of immortality that no military conquest could have provided. The young man who had once watched Socrates die for asking questions had spent his life proving that those questions were worth dying for. The emperor, who had wielded absolute power, had demonstrated that such power could be exercised with absolute virtue. The philosopher who had been forced to abandon his contemplative studies had discovered that the deepest truths are found not in books but in the lived experience of moral choice under pressure. The circle that had begun in an Athenian courtroom with a 20-year-old student watching his teacher drink hemlock had closed with a 60-year-old emperor writing his final meditation on a distant frontier. Between those moments lay a lifetime of struggle to understand what it means to live well in an imperfect world. Marcus Aurelius had found his answer not in abstract theory, but in daily practice, not in philosophical systems, but in the disciplined pursuit of virtue, regardless of external circumstances. The legacy Marcus Aurelius left behind was complex and contradictory, much like the man himself. Within decades of his death, the empire he had worked so tirelessly to preserve began showing cracks that would eventually become chasms. Commodus ruled for 12 years, and each year seemed to validate Marcus's darkest fears about dynastic succession. The son who had been raised in imperial luxury proved incapable of the self-discipline that had defined his father's reign. Where Marcus had sought to strengthen institutions and limit the arbitrary exercise of power, Commodus dismantled checks on imperial authority to indulge his personal whims. Where Marcus had maintained the careful balance between military necessity and civilian governance, Commodus allowed the Praetorian Guard to become a power unto themselves. Where Marcus had insisted on accessibility to all citizens regardless of rank, Commodus surrounded himself with sycophants who shielded him from unwelcome truths. The philosophical schools that had flourished under Marcus's patronage found themselves marginalized under his successor. Stoic teachers who had once enjoyed imperial favor discovered that their emphasis on virtue and self-restraint was unwelcome in a court dedicated to spectacle and excess. Many fled Rome entirely, carrying their teachings to provincial cities where local patrons still valued wisdom over entertainment. But the seeds of Marcus's intellectual legacy had already been planted too deeply to be easily uprooted. His private writings, circulating among a small circle of initiates, began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Soldiers who had served under the philosopher emperor found comfort in his reflections on duty and mortality. Administrators struggling to maintain justice in an increasingly corrupt system discovered practical wisdom in his meditations on leadership and moral choice. The meditations revealed something unprecedented in the literature of power. Here was absolute authority examining itself, questioning its own motives, acknowledging its own failures. Previous rulers had commissioned histories that celebrated their achievements or philosophers who justified their actions. Marcus had written for an audience of one, conducting an unflinching moral inventory that spared neither his decisions nor his character. These writings captured the attention of intellectuals across the empire who recognized something revolutionary in their honesty. The emperor who had commanded legions and governed provinces had struggled with the same moral dilemmas that plagued every human being. His responses to these challenges offered a model for ethical living that transcended political circumstances or social rank. Christian thinkers, despite their theological differences with pagan philosophy, found unexpected common ground in Marcus's emphasis on universal brotherhood and moral duty. His vision of humanity as a single community bound together by reason and justice resonated with their own teachings about divine love and human dignity. Some early Christian writers began incorporating Stoic insights into their theological frameworks, creating syntheses that would influence Western thought for centuries. The barbarian tribes that Marcus had fought and sometimes defeated also preserved aspects of his legacy, though in ways he could never have anticipated. Germanic chieftains who had negotiated with the philosopher emperor carried stories of his fairness and wisdom back to their peoples. These accounts, transformed through oral tradition, helped establish expectations about legitimate authority that would eventually influence medieval concepts of kingship. Roman law, which Marcus had worked to reform and codify, became perhaps his most enduring practical legacy. The legal principles he had championed, emphasizing due process and equal treatment, regardless of social status, provided foundations that would outlast the empire itself. When barbarian kingdoms eventually replaced Roman administration, many preserved elements of the legal system that had been refined under the philosopher emperor's guidance. The military reforms Marcus had initiated to address barbarian pressure proved prophetic in ways their author had not fully anticipated. His policies of controlled integration, bringing former enemies into Roman service, while gradually assimilating them into imperial culture, became templates for managing the demographic challenges that would define late antiquity. Future rulers who lacked his wisdom often abandoned these nuanced approaches in favor of simpler but ultimately self-defeating strategies. Educational institutions across the empire began incorporating Marcus's writings into their curricula, recognizing their value for training future administrators and military commanders. The combination of practical wisdom and moral reflection that characterized the Meditations offered exactly the kind of integrated learning that Roman culture had always prized. Students who might never face imperial responsibilities could still benefit from studying how absolute power had grappled with absolute accountability. The economic policies Marcus had developed to fund his frontier campaigns also left lasting impacts on imperial administration. His innovations in taxation and resource allocation, designed to distribute the costs of defense more equitably across the empire's diverse regions, became standard practices that helped maintain fiscal stability during subsequent crises. Even emperors who lacked his philosophical sophistication often found themselves implementing policies he had pioneered. As the 3rd century brought increasing instability to the Roman world, Marcus's example became a touchstone for those seeking to preserve civilized values amid growing chaos. Military commanders facing impossible choices between competing loyalties found guidance in his reflections on duty and honor. Civilian officials trying to maintain justice despite political pressure drew strength from his demonstrations that virtue could survive even in the corridors of absolute power. The mystery schools and philosophical academies that operated throughout the empire began developing interpretive traditions around Marcus's writings, treating them as sacred texts worthy of detailed commentary and analysis. These scholarly communities preserved not only his words but the intellectual framework within which those words had been conceived. They became repositories of classical learning that would prove crucial during the cultural disruptions of later centuries. Provincial governors facing barbarian incursions often invoked Marcus's memory when justifying policies of accommodation rather than simple military retaliation. His success in combining strength with mercy provided precedents that could be cited when local circumstances required diplomatic rather than purely military solutions. The philosopher emperor had demonstrated that pragmatic flexibility could coexist with unwavering principle. Religious movements across the empire, from traditional Roman cults to emerging Christian communities, found aspects of Marcus's legacy that resonated with their own teachings. His emphasis on personal responsibility and moral self-examination appealed to traditions that valued individual spiritual development. His vision of cosmic order and rational divine providence offered common ground between competing theological systems. The artistic and literary culture of the later empire bore subtle but persistent traces of Marcus's influence. Sculptors and painters began depicting imperial authority with greater emphasis on contemplative dignity rather than mere military prowess. Poets and historians found in his reign a model of leadership that prioritized wisdom over conquest, creating literary traditions that would shape how subsequent generations understood the proper relationship between power and virtue. Even as the Western Empire gradually fragmented under external pressure and internal decay, the Eastern territories that would become the Byzantine Empire preserved many of the institutional innovations that Marcus had pioneered. His approach to legal administration, military organization, and provincial governance provided frameworks that helped Eastern rulers maintain stability when their Western counterparts faced collapse. The philosophical schools of Athens and Alexandria, though diminished from their classical glory, continued to study and teach Marcus's writings as exemplars of applied ethics. His demonstration that Stoic principles could guide practical decision-making rather than remaining merely theoretical constructs influenced how these institutions approached the relationship between contemplation and action. Barbarian kingdoms that eventually established themselves within former Roman territories often adopted modified versions of the administrative systems that Marcus had refined. Germanic and Celtic rulers, despite their cultural differences from Roman tradition, recognized the practical value of legal frameworks that emphasized procedural fairness and predictable governance. They preserved elements of his legacy even while transforming the political contexts within which those elements operated. The monasticism that would become so important in medieval Christianity drew unexpected inspiration from Marcus's model of disciplined self-examination and service to others. Religious communities that rejected worldly power nonetheless found value in his demonstrations of how authority could be exercised with humility and restraint. The philosopher emperor had shown that even absolute power could be compatible with spiritual development. As classical learning gradually gave way to new cultural syntheses during the early medieval period, Marcus's writings provided bridges between pagan and Christian intellectual traditions. His emphasis on universal moral law and rational divine governance offered concepts that could be adapted to monotheistic frameworks without losing their essential insights about human nature and social responsibility. The military treatises and strategic analyses that medieval commanders would eventually develop often drew upon lessons that could be traced back to Marcus's frontier campaigns. His integration of defensive preparation with diplomatic engagement became a standard approach to border management that influenced military thinking long after the specific circumstances of his wars had been forgotten. Legal scholars in the emerging European kingdoms found in Marcus's jurisprudence principles that could be adapted to very different social and political circumstances. His emphasis on procedural fairness and proportional punishment provided foundations for legal systems that would eventually evolve into the constitutional traditions of modern Europe. The educational reforms that Marcus had sponsored to train competent administrators became models for similar efforts throughout the post-Roman world. His recognition that effective governance required both technical competence and moral development influenced how medieval institutions approached the preparation of future leaders. Even the agricultural and economic policies that Marcus had developed to support his extended military campaigns left traces in the administrative practices of successor states. His innovations in resource allocation and taxation provided precedents that helped new rulers manage the complex logistics of governing diverse populations with limited central authority. The diplomatic protocols that Marcus had established for negotiating with barbarian tribes became templates for managing relations between the emerging European kingdoms and their neighbours. His demonstration that military strength could be combined with genuine respect for foreign cultures influenced how medieval rulers approached the delicate balance between security and accommodation. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire became a memory rather than a reality, Marcus Aurelius emerged as something more than just another historical figure. He became a symbol of the possibility that power and wisdom could coexist, that authority could be exercised with justice, that even in the darkest times, individual virtue could make a difference. The man who had struggled with doubt and mortality in a frozen military camp along the Danube had achieved a form of immortality that no conquest could have provided. His legacy lived not in monuments or territories, but in ideas and ideals that continued to inspire long after the empire that had produced him had crumbled into dust. To him had crumbled into dust. And so we reach the end of our journey with Marcus Aurelius, a journey that began with a young aristocrat watching his teacher die for asking questions, and ended with an emperor writing his final meditation on a distant frontier. What have we learned from this extraordinary life? What can the philosopher emperor teach us about power, virtue, and the human condition? Marcus Aurelius proved something that many thought impossible. He demonstrated that absolute power need not corrupt absolutely, that wisdom and authority can coexist, that even at the pinnacle of worldly success, one can remain fundamentally human. He showed us that true strength comes not from conquering others, but from mastering ourselves. The man who commanded legions spent his life learning to command his own emotions, desires, and fears. His legacy reminds us that the most important battles are not fought on distant battlefields, but within our own souls. The choices we make when no one is watching, the integrity we maintain when expedience beckons, the compassion we show when power tempts us toward cruelty, these are the victories that truly matter. Marcus Aurelius lived these truths, and in doing so, he left us a roadmap for navigating our own moral challenges. In our modern world, where power often seems divorced from responsibility and success from character, Marcus offers a different model. He reminds us that leadership is service, that authority is accountability, that the highest achievement is not what we gain, but who we become in the process of gaining it. The questions Marcus wrestled with in his private meditations remain as urgent today as they were 18 centuries ago. How do we find meaning in suffering? How do we maintain hope in the face of inevitable loss? How do we live virtuously in an imperfect world?